So this is called the three-leg sustainability model. So basically the idea is that we have three legs. One is environmental, one is social, and one is economic. So environmental has all of these, kind of tenets. It has a natural world. So as you know, we have forests and mangroves and all these things, as I said. But this also comes into what our environmental policy is, what our energy policies are, what our consumer policies are. So that kind of goes into that. Then we have the economic leg, which is made up of companies and organizations and startups and SMEs, infrastructure, jobs, trading, all of these things. And then the social leg has different components like culture, health and education, arts, health services, like all of these things. So each leg is made out of all of these things, right? And the idea is that if one leg was broken or wobbly, the whole stool would be wobbly or broken and you could not sit on it or you would fall, right? So it's not the most sustainable model because they're all working not in tandem, but they're separate. So there's not enough overlap. So in that way, this was one of the first sustainability models that was being used that kind of envision all these things a bit, not together. Then they thought, okay, maybe we can have this kind of model, which is called the three circles overlapping model. Over here, we see the economy, society, environment as like a Venn diagram that comes together first. This is like the sweet spot, right? Where it says sustainability lives here. But the problem with this model, like it sounds great, but the problem is that we live in a realistic world, right? Like things are not perfect. All of these circles over here are the same size, but actually, as we know in the world, that's not how it works, right? How it's working right now, our economy is huge, like it's a huge circle. Society then is a bit bigger, but not just because our society is so just and equal, but because we have such a massive population, right? And then the environment actually is probably the least of our priorities, globally speaking, right? So in that way, this is not a very sustainable model. So thirdly, and lastly, this is maybe the newest kind of model that a lot of sustainability scientists think it might be, still has issues, but maybe out of the three, the best one. So it's called the three nested dependencies model. So over here, we understand that this is that each is dependent on each other and that they all actually operate within the environment, the larger environment. And if something goes wrong in one, the other will be affected, especially if something goes wrong in the environment, which is being affected by the economy and society, then the economy and society will suffer. So for instance, question to all of you, when the Pakistan floods happened, was it an environmental disaster, a social disaster, or an economic disaster? So just a few questions to consider before we move on. So which sustainability model do you think is most dominant in the world today? These two, I would say, are the most dominant in a way. And then the three nested dependencies one is the reality of the situation, but our sustainability usually isn't seen in this way, or like our policies aren't made in this way where we understand how these things impact each other. Like for instance, we have an environmental policy, we have an economic policy, but if you go through policy briefs, you'll realize that these are actually treated like such separate issues. They're not ever like hardly any kind of policy or any safety mechanism that thinks of these two. So also some questions about which sustainability model is most relevant or accurate to your business. So recently I wrote an article about climate justice in Gilgit-Baltistan. So as you know, as I'm sure most of you know, that when the Attabad Lake disaster happened in 2010, that's actually what created the Attabad Lake that we all know to be very beautiful, but actually it's a water graveyard when you really think about it, right? And it's interesting how now there's a lot of tourism, of course, happening around that area, and a lot of like these high-end hotels have come about that obviously it's not made by the people of Gilgit, but it's people coming in from the rest of Pakistan And even though they're saying, oh, this is, we've made this hotel, it's good for the economy and it'll uplift the society, but actually it's going to have a more negative impact on that environment, right? Because it's not actually sustainable. So moving on, okay, so this is like, I would say one of the most like happening topics in sustainability right now. It's economic social governance, ESG. You might have heard this word thrown around a lot. So it's touted as like this, very innovative sustainability model, but there's a lot of criticism that it's going to allow companies to kind of carry on with business as usual. So I'll tell you a bit about more ESG and the good and bad points. So ESG is basically a framework that helps stakeholders understand how an organization is managing risks and opportunities related to environmental, social, and governance criteria, sometimes called ESG factors. So one other thing I wanted to say that, right now we're talking about, we're like in a transitionary space right now, where we are trying to change the world into a more sustainable place. And when we say sustainable, it's not just environmental, it's social as well, right? So as we know that, women and minorities do not, in the current world order, don't have the same kind of opportunities as men. And even if women do have the same equal opportunities, they have so many barriers that to actually succeed in those opportunities is very difficult, right? So for instance, you might get the same job, great job, top job as a man, but if you have children and all of these things that are your primary responsibility, you're going to be suffering more, right? And you're more time poor. So these are like all things to consider, right? So this is kind of reimagining these things and kind of being like holistic with it. And then governance also takes into consideration that what are actually the environmental and social policies that the government has, not only just for the specific country, but also the company. So as we know, lots of corporations like Nestle, Coca-Cola, they have actual governance structures, right? So it's about holding them accountable. So people who are at the top, they can be held accountable for the decisions they make, right? I notice in Pakistan, a lot of startups in lots of spaces, they are working more with sometimes, getting grants, or they're kind of link with the CSR of like big corporations, so things like that. So it's good to know that things are changing a bit. So, but why are climate activists skeptical of this? So there's one kind of skepticism is that it's not standardized, right? Just like CSR was never standardized, ESG is obviously lots of steps ahead of that because it actually takes into ESG accounting and finance. But there's no actual gold standard, right? So a lot of companies actually end up greenwashing. Recently, I think last year, Coca-Cola made the first ever plastic road in Islamabad, right? Like right next to, I think, that's not the solution. You can't make a road out of plastic. That's still like the plastic won't disintegrate. That's still a problem. So, so this is a big issue with ESG as well. And if you notice, so ESG is also closer to the 3 overlapping model than the nested approach. So again, it's, your economic incentives could be way bigger than your social ones. So that's again, not really what we call true sustainability. So this is ISP environmental solutions. That is really interesting kind of circularity company. And this is actually how we make our pitch decks, just so they're a bit different. I mean, that might give you some ideas as well. And, it gives you a good overview of like how many emissions, how much energy you want to produce, how much emissions are you taking into consideration. So these are just some ideas. So then Eco Energy is a solar company. So yeah, so this is the impact it has. So these are some. So Easy Bike, you might have seen them around Islamabad. So again, this has different kinds of impact. It's kind of, changing the infrastructure, e-mobility infrastructure in Pakistan. Then we have Green Innovation, which again is circular economy. It has, basically, it's kind of replacing LPG. Then we have Light Solar, that's another solar company. Again, Mode Mobility, and they're really interesting because they have bikes that are specially made for women. Then Easy Geezer, again, very interesting work that they're doing in the market. Functioning autonomous, like using IoT. So they're like really like smart geezers. So that's all. Thank you, everyone.